Welcome everyone, this is Honest Restart, and as you can probably tell from the video, we're going to be talking about creatures we could be seeing coming to Breath of the Wild 2. Now, before we get into things, I want you guys to sort of consider this mindset I've had recently. So let me show you this trailer here. Yes, this is the initial trailer for Breath of the Wild. At the time, we knew of it as Zelda U. Lately, I've been thinking of this trailer as more of a trailer for not just Breath of the Wild, but also for Breath of the Wild 2 as well. Now hear me out here. Yes, it's actually a trailer for Breath of the Wild, I get that. But I feel like so many things changed since then. If you take a look at this trailer, the environment just looks different. The lighting, the fog, the terrain itself. But then going beyond that, we notice that the environments are destructible. There's more detail, there's more foliage even on the Guardian itself. Sure, the resolution is lower, and ultimately, they made a lot of design choices for Breath of the Wild that made the game still look good. But what we saw with this trailer just isn't what we got with Breath of the Wild. There are a lot of differences. Perhaps there are a lot of ideas they were considering at one point that they were not able to realize with the initial Breath of the Wild. But with Breath of the Wild 2, as we know that they've been working on a lot of DLC ideas that translated to a sequel, perhaps there were other ideas that they didn't get to implement or didn't get to fully execute that they will try and implement with the sequel. Considering that, when you take a look at this trailer, doesn't this world seem a bit more lively? Breath of the Wild takes place in a post-apocalyptic world. That's not what this trailer is, in my opinion. At least, it doesn't seem like that given the farmers and such on the field. Anyway, this is just something I want you guys to keep in mind as we progress with the video. But before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check those all out. They're in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. Going off of what we discussed in the introduction, how this version of Hyrule will likely have more going on because of the progression of technology and the implementation of different ideas they had for Breath of the Wild, this world is going to have more, for sure, but I think there's more reason than just that. When we take a look at the story for Breath of the Wild, it's all about Hyrule being in a post-apocalyptic era. The calamity destroyed a lot of things, there was a lot of devastation, life ran away from it. But with Breath of the Wild 2, technically, before Ganondorf has his whole resurrection, we're seeing peace. Link and Zelda repel the calamity, and there's some period of time in between Breath of the Wild 1 and 2 where there is an effort to restore Hyrule. So with this effort to restore Hyrule and this at least temporary peace where the calamity has been repelled, life may start to build back up again. Creatures that ran away from the calamity may come back to Hyrule and sort of start living more organically as they did way back when. What types of creatures could we see? Well, that's what we're sort of focusing on for the video, different creatures we may see in Breath of the Wild 2. And actually the sequel trailer already suggests some different species will be in this game. So for example, there's this weird buffalo-like creature that Link and Zelda are using in the sequel trailer. We've never seen it before throughout the entire world of Breath of the Wild. Why? Well, maybe because it's one of those creatures that wasn't around because of the calamity, but since the calamity has been repelled and they're trying to restore Hyrule, perhaps building more towns and farms and breeding livestock, and also maybe because some creatures migrated back to this land, we're seeing other creatures, including this buffalo. And with that in mind, it wouldn't surprise me that in Breath of the Wild 2, we will see more types of creatures that we can mount, perhaps like this buffalo, or maybe they'll even go back to other creatures that we couldn't quite mount in Breath of the Wild, but we will be able to in the sequel. But there's another animal that we see in the sequel trailer, and that's the rat that's enveloped by the calamity. It's entirely possible that the calamity will possess this creature and make it more of an enemy, but at least until before this malice consumes it, it is just a normal rat, a normal little creature that is exploring the caverns of Hyrule. We've seen rats in different Zelda games in the past, but we didn't see them in Breath of the Wild. I think it's another example of creatures returning back to the world of Hyrule. And considering that Eiji Aonuma has already pretty much told us that we will be returning to Hyrule, we are going to be exploring more of this world and seeing more things, and they're probably going to need to put a lot more content into this game to make it make sense, to make it feel more fresh and interesting, because we're going to be playing in the same environment. I say that with air quotes because surely they'll be changing around a lot. There's already a few different types of creatures and animals that we see throughout the world of Breath of the Wild 1, but I feel like some of them will be expanded upon. The same way how I talked about how some creatures that we already had, like the rhinoceros, could become mountable, we could see more variations with the different types of creatures, like fishes and bugs. We've actually seen a lot more different types of fishes and bugs in different Zelda games. In Twilight Princess, there were the golden insects that you could collect. Maybe we could see the return of those types of creatures. We are going to need more things to collect this time around. I doubt they'll do Korok seeds again. And while there were ways to collect fish in the water and trick them to get back on shore, or you could sort of take them out while they're in the water and they would float to the surface and you could pick them up, there wasn't a traditional way to fish in Breath of the Wild, but fishing has been one of those big staples we've seen in a lot of different Zelda games, like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. And specifically with Twilight Princess, we did have quite a few different types of fish variants. So maybe with Breath of the Wild 2, we'll be seeing even more fish than we saw in Breath of the Wild 1, but also maybe they give us a fishing rod this time around so we can catch them in a more traditional kind of way, but they'll turn it into a fun little minigame like we've seen in previous games. Now, I'm sure in the comments you guys are going to have different ideas for different creatures we've seen in previous Zelda games that could be returning to Hyrule with the Calamity repelled. But there's one species I have in mind that's not the Loftwings, we'll get to that a little bit later, that I think we could see in Breath of the Wild 2. And that's the milk cows. So if you think about it, while there may be some steer in Breath of the Wild, there are no cows, there are no milk cows. We've seen them in different Zelda games in the past, why aren't they in Breath of the Wild, this massive game that has far more content than any previous Zelda game? Well, milk cows are for farms. There really aren't too many farms in Breath of the Wild. Everything is in ruins. But in this future Hyrule, where hopefully they are restoring Hyrule and there will be more life, there will likely be some farms. And with some farms, there's going to be some milk cows. Now, hold on a second, I realize that may seem perhaps inconsequential, but milk cows were valuable in previous Zelda games. They gave you milk, which you could use to heal yourself. Perhaps that mechanic will be returning again. But now let's move on to why I think we could be seeing Loftwings in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. So when we take a look at that sequel trailer, at the very end, we see Hyrule Castle rising up from the ground. We don't know quite how high it's gonna go, but it's certainly rising up. Perhaps it'll be something like how Ganondorf had the castle in Ocarina of Time, how it was suspended in the air above the normal level of the ground. But it also could be going even further up, perhaps above the clouds, perhaps around the parts where we have seen other areas in different Zelda games, like Skyloft in Skyward Sword or the City in the Sky in Twilight Princess. Perhaps they're going to be expanding upon the environments we can explore in the sky. In Breath of the Wild, it is considered to be an open-air game. There is certainly a lot more exploration to be had in the air. There's a bit more verticality to Breath of the Wild than other open-world games. And as we've seen with the trailer, there's certainly a focus on the underground parts of Hyrule, the caverns. So perhaps we'll be exploring a lot more of the underside. But also, we could be maybe exploring a lot more above as well. Perhaps they're going to be expanding on that. Breath of the Wild has so much different nods and references to different parts of Hyrule. The world is so vast that most areas that have been in some sort of Zelda game at one point or another are referenced in Breath of the Wild. There are a few exceptions though. There are a lot of the classical style dungeons and temples we've seen throughout the different Zelda games. Very few of them are actually referenced within the map for Hyrule, but also we're missing out on the areas we've seen in the sky in different Zelda games. So maybe with Breath of the Wild 2, since we are returning to Hyrule supposedly, they're going to take this opportunity to give us more to explore both below and above. That's what I think the rising castle at the end of the trailer could be suggesting. At the very least, they're certainly going to be expanding upon the open air concept and enhancing it, giving us more to do in every part of Hyrule, including the air. And with that in mind, let's also consider that they are currently remastering Skyward Sword. When they were remastering both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, there were some suggestions made that some ideas from those games would be translated over to Breath of the Wild. And when they introduced Skyward Sword, Eiji Aonuma did talk about how there were some mechanics that did eventually make it into Breath of the Wild that we first started to see in Skyward Sword. Maybe they're also going to be taking a second look at Skyward Sword and considering some other ideas as well, like exploration in the sky. If there's going to be more sky exploration, they might need different ways to explore that sky. Perhaps like Loftwings, which sort of brings us full circle here because the entire point of this video is talking about how different creatures could be coming back to Hyrule. One creature we haven't seen since Skyward Sword are the Loftwings. Perhaps with Calamity Ganon being at least temporarily defeated, we see different creatures returning, including those Loftwings, and Nintendo puts them in there because it does make sense in terms of giving us more options to explore the sky, especially with a risen Hyrule Castle. Now, while this may make sense to a degree, I think it's also worth noting that the Loftwings were just in Skyward Sword. We haven't really seen them referenced at all in any other Zelda game. So to see them return in Breath of the Wild 2 might be a little random. But let's keep in mind that this Zelda game is likely going to be the biggest Zelda game ever. Breath of the Wild 1 was already the biggest Zelda game ever. Breath of the Wild 2 will surely expand upon that. They're gonna need more ideas, more characters and creatures in the world. They're gonna have to fill that up. And with that potential of there being more areas to explore in the sky, they're gonna need more methods of air travel. Loftwings make both a lot of sense from a gameplay perspective, but also from a story perspective, as I've sort of talked about throughout the course of this video. But those are just some of the ideas of what we can maybe see return to Hyrule this time around. I'm sure you guys have different ideas for different creatures we could be seeing in Breath of the Wild, but also maybe you guys have different ideas for other things that could be returning as well, like temples and items, or perhaps different characters or enemies. There's so much potential for the sequel. I'm very excited, so yeah, we'll be continually talking about this until obviously we get the game, and then also probably beyond that as well. But that's all for now. This is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.